to the Metro on WDET, Detroit Public Radio. I'm Robin Vincent.
And I'm Tia Graham. It's Black History Month. And as the country goes in several different directions, the idea of celebrating Black history is being questioned by those newly in power. Detroit is one of the rare cities in this country with a majority Black population, with Black people actually in powerful positions. So what does Black history mean to the city of Detroit? And we're asking you, in one of America's majority Black cities, what does the future of Black Detroit look like? How can Black residents here truly thrive? The number is 313-577-1019.
But first, Tia, we got to go back. We have to go way back to the North Atlantic slave trade, which is a long, bloody history that this country hasn't even fully confronted today. What can we say about Detroit and its relationship with Black people? Since its founding in 1701, slavery was widely practiced. Roy E. Finkenbine is a history professor and department co-chair at University of Detroit Mercy. He's also the director of the Black Abolitionist Archive, and we are going to trace some of slavery's roots in Detroit with him now. Professor Finkenbine, thank you for joining us on the Metro.
Oh, glad to join you.
So the city of Detroit, it was founded in 1701, and something that came with it was slavery. Could you talk to us about early Detroit and what enslavement of Africans looked like at the time? Were they considered indentured servants then?
Well, they were actually slaves bought and sold. The indentured servitude was sometimes used as a mask to cover up for what was real slavery with Black people. In other words, there was not the expectation that they would be liberated at a certain point in time, as there were with white servants that signed indentures. Detroit becomes an American city in 1796 when, post-revolution, the British finally withdraw. At that point, we actually have some numbers. There were 300 slaves on the American side of the Detroit River. The largest was William McComb, after whom the county north of us is named. We only know the first names of a few of his slaves, but McComb left his name on the landscape, so did a lot of men like Campo, Beaubien, Brush, DeQuinder, Grosbeck, Livernois, John R. Williams, and others who, we have a lot of street names in Detroit named after slaveholders.
Yeah.
We didn't have plantations like the case was in the South. Local slaves worked on small farms as house servants, as store clerks, as craftspeople. Toward the end of the French period, which had been the 1760s, the French and Indian War, 25% of Detroit residents owned slaves. So it was not like the South, but it was not unimportant.
Professor Finkenbine, that's a lot, a quarter of residents. And can you say again at that time period when that was, that a quarter of residents owned slaves?
That would have been about the 1760s, the end of the French period. We know that slaveholding lasted from, as you said, the beginning of the city and its founding in 1701 until about the 1820s. But it's largely a forgotten enterprise today. Bill McGraw, who's a local historian and journalist, notes that Detroit seems to have selective memory on the subject. And, he raised the question of where should we begin? And maybe one of the things is to acknowledge it, but the second is, should we really be honoring these people in county names, street names, et cetera?
I wanted to ask you about that because I think it's making a lot of people just bristle at the notion when we think about the amount of time that we've spent on these streets saying these names and how enmeshed they are into daily life. What's your opinion on that? Should the street names be renamed?
Well, I think at the very least, the question has to be revisited. And, I think in a formal way, the city, the counties should revisit that question. I think over time, fortunately, our views about slavery have changed, and should we still be honoring what some might call the worst of the worst?
Right, right. Let's talk a little bit about the conditions of enslaved Africans, if we could. Did Africans live on the land with the owners? What was their quality of life like at the time?
Fairly Spartan. There's an attempt after the end of slavery in some of our early historical societies and things like that in the city to repaint it as a much more benign kind of servitude than occurred in the South. It was different, but it was still very harsh, fairly Spartan. These people would not have had much by way of free time, very Spartan in terms of diet and clothing. They would have lived in attics or garrets or basements, sometimes lean-tos at the back of houses. It's not a great life. And also, they're not the ones calling the shots on what happens with their children. If they have children, what happens with their chance to marry, to have a spouse. That's in the hands, just as it is in the South, that's in the hands of the owner. And so, their life was very controlled, arguably, more difficult because of the weather. A lot of these people who had come from Africa or from the Caribbean, this was very foreign to them, and they weren't really given adequate clothing. So, look outside today and think and think about what that might mean.
It sounds absolutely horrendous. Professor Finkenbine, why do you think that so many of these details, so many of these important threads of history relating to Detroit and the enslavement of African people have been forgotten? I mean, you have made it your job to highlight them. Why have they been forgotten by so many?
Well, we like to, history in community after community is full of silences and forgetting, and we like to highlight the things that make us feel good about our community, ourselves, where we live, and our forebears. And the reality is, in Detroit, for example, the Underground Railroad story is told a lot, and I've been part of that retelling. I think it's important, but it's a very positive thing about who and what we are. The existence of slavery here for well over 100 years isn't as enticing. We don't want to remember it. We don't want to retell it. And we're not alone in that. Community, most Americans have forgotten completely that slavery existed in the North. It existed in all 13 colonies. It wasn't just a Southern phenomenon until after the Revolution. And Canada does the same thing. Canada had slavery. Today we remember Canada as the haven. If you get to the Detroit River and get over, you're in freedom land. And the reality is, Canada had slavery for a couple hundred years. And there's one incident, a slave woman named Angelique who tries to change the equation literally by burning down the town of Montreal when it was a wooden city in the late 1600s. So, it's really that matter of us wanting to craft a positive story about where we live because we think it says something about ourselves.
You're listening to The Metro on WDET. I'm Robin Vincent.
And I'm Tia Graham. We're speaking with Roy E. Finkenbine. He's a professor, history professor, department co-chair at University of Detroit Mercy. He is also the director of the Black Abolitionist Archive. So, Professor, let's just get into that a little bit more. The Underground Railroad, the importance of the Second Baptist Church here in the city of Detroit, and this idea, like you talked about, growing up for me hearing these stories, it always felt as if Detroit and the North was the savior for enslaved Africans. But in truth, slavery was really widespread here.
Well, it was widespread, and that forgetting that I talked about begins to happen the moment that slavery is phased out here. By the 1820s, it's largely gone locally for a variety of reasons I'll talk about in a minute. By the 1830s, there are 3 slaves left in Michigan territory, and when it becomes a state, there's none. And Michigan and Detroit really quickly began to try to paint themselves as a beacon of liberty on the Great Lakes, as I've termed it. But I should make the point that the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which established law and territorial government, north of the Ohio River, and what includes Michigan and Detroit, actually prohibited slavery here. But when the British finally abandoned Detroit under much pressure in 1796, that becomes the effective law. But slave owners in the courts interpret that to mean that the people already enslaved would remain slaves. Canada does the same thing on the Canadian, the Ontario side. So we have this weird situation in the early 19th century where slaves are running from Canada to Detroit for freedom, and other slaves here are running from Detroit to Canada for freedom. So the Underground Railroad kind of means something different early on in this part of the world. But once you get past the end of slavery, you get past the 1820s, in particular in Detroit, people start coming up here. And also, the beginning of white settlement in southern Michigan is heavily infused by people that are coming from New York, New England, who have a bit of a reform emphasis, have a bit of a problem with slavery. You also have free blacks coming up here. You have freedom seekers coming up here. You have Quaker settlement in southern Michigan, places like Adrian and Raisin Township. And those folks begin to sway the feeling about slavery to opposing it very much. And Detroit fairly quickly becomes a place that slaveholders come to recognize as a tough nut to crack in terms of catching and returning slaves. There's a famous case here in 1833 where they capture a couple called the Blackburns, and it's actually takes place around where Skillman Library is today, where the old jail used to be. But the fact of the matter is the community rises up, black and white, and protects this couple, gets them over to Canada. It becomes a major element in the creation of Canada's extradition laws with the United States that continue up to the, if it's not a crime in Canada, which it's becoming not a crime in Canada by the 1830s, slaves can run away there and they will not be returned unless they commit other crimes that are crimes in Canada, murder, theft, whatever.
So, Professor, I want to stick with Canada a little bit because that's something that's so interesting to me. Did a little bit of research in the past about the Amherstburg Museum there, talking about Amherstburg and its history with Black Americans, then turned Black Canadians, and then as well just Ontario and Windsor and what it meant to Black folks, especially as we see slavery end in Detroit as well as in Canada, and we start to see this a little bit more of a communal connection happening, especially within the church system as well. So could you talk a little bit about what we're starting to see after slavery, especially as we start to get towards the Civil War? What are we seeing with these communities as they're growing?
Well, Amherstburg is the first major crossing point for freedom seekers trying to get to Canada that are coming up from the South. The 1790s, two things happen. One, and it happens the same year, 1793, the Congress passes a Fugitive Slave Act, which allows slave catchers or owners to go anywhere in the U.S., including so-called free states, and capture and return their slaves. Same year, Canada, Ontario, which is then called Upper Canada, their legislature passes a law beginning the process of ending slavery. And so slaves start coming northward. And the point they first take is really from Brownstown over to Amherstburg. So you get this real influx of freedom seekers settling in around Amherstburg. It's not until the 1830s that you see more and more coming up to Detroit. And at that point, it's the Detroit-Windsor connection that becomes important. And what you mentioned churches, what a lot of the Black churches that develop in places like Detroit do is they have sister churches that they work with over in Windsor and Sandwich, which is now was then a separate town, now a part of Windsor. And so they're religiously connected. They're also networked in terms of getting people across the river, providing them with the services that they need, protection, food, shelter, medical care, et cetera. What we might today call refugee services, although, that sometimes becomes a dirty word, too.
Unfortunately, today, yes, it does. Professor, that's so much information, so much rich history there I would love to get into one day, but we can't get to there right now. We're going to continue going forward. What does Detroit, or when does it begin? What does it look like during the Civil War, after the Civil War, and especially during Reconstruction, where we start to see more Black people holding land or holding certain powers, positions of power?
Well, the fact that we had a vibrant Black community here by the decades immediately preceding the war, establishing their institutions, getting educated, developing businesses, founding churches, et cetera, means that these people can take the lead once freedom comes nationally. And you see that with a lot of northern communities, Detroit, one of the foremost among them, sometimes going south and teaching the newly freed African Americans, holding political positions. We start to get in Detroit in the period after the Civil War, the first Blacks to hold a political position in the city. We get Black-owned and run newspapers that begin to, if I can quote another Black paper, too long have others spoken for us. We need to speak for ourselves. And so there's this real stepping out on freedom and taking hold of what it might mean for them. And I would say that includes freedom seekers that come north and get educated and establish themselves. It also means a lot of free Blacks that, as the South becomes more untenable, leave places like Fredericksburg, Virginia, or Louisville, Kentucky, and come up to Detroit. And those become some of the first educators, some of the first Black politicians, some of the first Black businessmen in the city, and they play a huge role.
And before we let you go, because we're talking about just the building of Detroit and the building of Black communities within Detroit, I think about Reconstruction and how that era led to communities like Paradise Valley and Black Bottom. Could you talk a little bit about that moment in history in Detroit when we're starting to see a true, I don't want to say a peak, but truly you're starting to see a peak of what that Black freedom looks like in these communities?
Well, yeah, and let me go down to the South just for 30 seconds.
Okay.
The Reconstruction, begins when the Civil War ends and emancipation begins with the 13th Amendment. And Black families and communities had real hopes that now they would be able to achieve and define all the things that freedom had meant to them, but they had been denied during slavery. But this is a period in the South of tremendous racial violence against Blacks. That would last decades, the Klan and lynching and all of these things. It's also a period when Blacks are made into, despite the hope of what they thought freedom would mean, they're turned into second-class citizens. The vote is taken away. They get in trouble if they try to achieve more than white folks think they should be achieving, given a second-class education system. And so that leads to, by the time you get to the early 20th century, a lot of Black Southerners making the calculated decision to go north to places like Detroit. Detroit is, in a sense, the promised land. It is the place where they can get beyond Jim Crow. They can get, hopefully, they think, beyond lynching. It's where the children can get an education. In fact, do get an education both in public schools and Catholic schools and so forth. It's not without problems, but many say, to their relatives in the South, they write and say, come on up here. It's much better here. and many of them do. I mean, Black Bottom, Paradise Valley, all those places come out of that hope and that drive to go north and realize freedom in a more complete way.
Yeah, Roy E. Finkenbine is a history professor and department co-chair at University of Detroit Mercy. He is also the director of the Black Abolitionist Archive. Professor, we will definitely speak with you very, very soon again on the Metro.
Okay, it was good talking to you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Next, we talk about the impact Black utopians left on Detroit with author Aaron Robertson. This is The Metro on WDET. We'll be right back. Stay with us.
On WDET, I'm Tia Graham.
And I'm Robin Vincent. Religion and freedom are intimately linked. And for many Black Americans, spirituality and religion intersect with freedom in complicated ways. Enslaved Africans came to this country with religions and traditions, most of which were stripped upon arrival and replaced with new forms of worship. Once the freedoms of Black Americans were slowly granted after the Civil War, the ideas for what the future could look like and how to achieve that future were beginning to take root. Black-led cities, towns, and small communities began to flourish, many short-lived, but their ideas of a paradise on earth persisted. The Black Utopians, Searching for Paradise and the Promised Land in America, is a nonfiction look at what happened when Black Americans were dreaming of better lives and different ways of religious thinking. The book follows along the histories of these movements, including the history of the Black Christian nationalist movement and the Shrine of the Black Madonna in Detroit. Tia spoke with Aaron Robertson, the author of Black Utopians, to learn more about religion, counterculture, and liberation. Robertson is a Detroiter, Rhodes Scholar, and a translator of Italian literature.
Aaron, welcome to the Metro.
Hi, it's great to be here.
When you began writing the book, where did the core question of the book come from? What does utopia mean to you, and what does it mean to Black Americans?
Yeah, in part, the question of utopia is very personal. So I grew up, going to this small town in Tennessee where my grandparents are from. It was called Promised Land. It was an all-Black town that was founded in 1870, so soon after the Civil War ended and during the Reconstruction period. And I was so interested in this really vibrant history of Black-led communities and Black-led spaces in which African Americans attempted to create, better lives, for themselves. And I knew that this was kind of a broad history that stretched from, the Reconstruction era up to the present even. I mean, I think we saw since 2020 a kind of explosion of Black utopian initiatives and conversations. So you can think of the conversations that were happening around, reparations, questions of reparative justice, and how to really transform the world so that Black people feel provided for in not only in politics, but in education, right, and sort of being able to provide food for communities and spaces of spiritual refuge as well. So all of these questions were central to the book.
And you begin the book in Promised Land, Tennessee, your ancestral home. You talk about going back and being with your grandparents. I have similar experience, not going back to Tennessee, but going to a rural space, going to dirt roads and a farm and seeing chickens and cows and having this really mixed living and growing up, of having the city life versus this country life and this understanding and having that space that feels safe. So can you talk about that experience there and go into the town's history a little bit more, but why you consider it your ancestral home?
Yeah, I mean, it's my ancestral home, simply because my dad's dad was born there, and he was so proud of being from this small town. And as a kid, I didn't have a great appreciation for the history necessarily. It was just kind of an escape from the city.
Yeah.
It was an opportunity to be with, family and kind of have family reunions. But as I grew older, I realized that this was one of many towns that were scattered throughout the American South, throughout the West too, where Black communities had sort of coalesced out of necessity and need. My grandfather was always insistent that his grandchildren really embrace this community, embrace what it meant for our family, and so I think the sort of weight and responsibility of that began to sort of settle as I grew older.
Yeah. And, Promised Land is one anchor for the book, but you also talk about Black nationalist commune and what it looked like and how it came about. So as you're going through, you're learning, you're researching and finding these spaces and places. What was going through your mind when you found out about the Black nationalist commune?
Yeah, I mean, I think when we think about utopia in general, a lot of us may think of the kind of hippie communes that were spreading in the 1960s, the Back to the Land movement, where mostly, white middle-class younger people, would leave society to try to stake out a better life. Those stories are very, important to understanding, what the counterculture actually meant. But African Americans have always been central to what we think of as the American counterculture. And so when I learned about the Shrine of the Black Madonna and all of the sort of experiments that the church was involved in, I realized, well, okay, here is a Black nationalist church that was active during the late 60s and really began some of its most radical experiments in the 1970s. Well, this was a period that directly overlapped with the countercultural period in general. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to kind of create a counter narrative of American utopias. And I think the Shrine was kind of a natural place to start. I had this personal link, obviously, to Detroit, but I grew up going to so many kinds of churches in Detroit and the surrounding area, but I didn't actually learn about the Shrine until 2019. The churches that I went to, I'll say, were not, the emphasis was not on political activism. That was not central, really. And so to learn about this church that was trying to create innovative, educational experiments, that was trying to establish communes throughout the country, that was, sending out these cadres of missionaries around the country to raise money for decades so that they could eventually, in the late 1990s, buy thousands of acres of farmland in South Carolina. I mean, this was an incredible story. So I wanted to explore that.
Oh, I mean, right now, if you're joining us, we're chatting with Aaron Robertson, the author of Black Utopians. We're chatting about the book and its in-depth look at religion and freedom in American Black culture. And you just hit on something really, really great there, because you're talking about going to different churches. I grew up in a Baptist church as well, with my grandparents going to different churches throughout Belleville, Sumter Township, but as well going throughout the city of Detroit. And I often think about the connection there between Black Americans and religion and how we formed our different ways of worshiping. So in your mind, when you're seeing the Black Nationalist Commune, you're seeing the Shrine of Black Madonna, what are some of the things that you're thinking about in terms of your personal connection with religion and what you just learned in 2019? Because you're learning it as an adult man. You're a man, you're grown, and you're learning something new that's a new hit to your ideas of religion. So what did it do to your way of thinking?
Yeah, I think one of the remarkable things about Albert Clegg Jr., the pastor of the Shrine, and the philosophy that he espoused, which he called Black Christian nationalism, he was attempting to redefine the foundations of what Christianity meant. And so he is best known for popularizing the idea of a Black Messiah. And if you walk into the shrine, one of the first things you'll see is a mural of a Black Madonna and child. And I think at the time, and even now, that sort of, it is seen as really radical, to say the least. But I think that in normal stories about the shrine, that is kind of where the story ends. You had this pastor who said that Christ was Black, but actually in saying that and pushing that narrative, what Albert Clegg was telling his people was that the foundations of reality as you know it may not be, we can transform those. All of the stories that we inherit from society, we have the right and ability to question those. And so if religious beliefs can be turned on their head, then maybe political beliefs can too, and maybe beliefs about how the economy works can be turned upside down as well. Mm-hmm. So I think that sort of, theological innovation that Clegg that he instituted was the starting point for a much larger revolution in how we think about Black life in America.
Aaron Robertson is the author of Black Utopians, Searching for Paradise and the Promised Land in America. The book made it to the top of several Best of 2024 lists, including the New York Times, Time, Essence, and the New Yorker.
This is The Metro on WDET, and we're talking Black history and Detroit history this hour. And we want to hear from you. In one of America's majority Black cities, what does the future of Black Detroit look like? And how can Black residents here truly thrive? You can join in on the conversation at 313-577-1019.
This is The Metro on WDET. We'll be right back. Stay with us. On WDET. I'm Robin Vincent.
And I'm Tia Graham. Today, Black Americans still face major systemic obstacles. They have 1/10 the wealth of white Americans, and Black people are more likely to live in poverty, more likely to experience negative health outcomes. They are incarcerated at higher rates, and more than other, the list continues to go on. Now, in the face of that adversity, Black leaders and thinkers are still finding ways to uplift the community and envision a future where Black people can thrive.
Our next guest is an example. Lauren Hood is a professor of practice in urban planning at the University of Michigan. She's also the founder of the Institute of Afro-Urbanism and Action Lab, working at the intersection of Black aspiration and community transformation. Lauren, welcome back to the Metro, or Professor Hood, I should say.
You can say Lauren. My students don't even use Professor Hood. Thank you for having me again.
So we've been discussing the history of Black people in Detroit. We know things like redlining neighborhoods perpetuated the wealth gap, the inequities that Tia mentioned. But what other ways has our built environment affected the Black community?
That's a good question. I think where my practice is now wants to be focused on aspiration, so it's hard for me to stay rooted in talking about gaps and adversity, because I feel like even as you were recounting those things, like I had a visceral, physical reaction to hearing Black folks described in that way, because those things are true and accurate, but they're more related to our position in a system versus being part of our identity. But I feel like the more that we use that kind of language to talk about ourselves, we kind of adopt it as an identity and then behave in a certain way. So I had to intentionally orient my practice towards aspiration and focusing on our particular set of strengths and how we amplify what we're already good at and what's already working, instead of focusing on fighting against what isn't working and staying rooted in like adversity and struggle.
Let's go there then.
Yeah.
What is working and what do you want to see more of? And I want to ask you that from a planning perspective.
Well, it's interesting. So I'm trained as an urban planner. I teach urban planning. My degree is in community development. So I feel like I was oriented and educated toward the built environment. So when I would talk about a city like a Detroit, I'm thinking more like spatially. But now when I think about my work and what's happening in that space, when I think about my work now, I'm thinking more what's happening to people. So when you talk about a Detroit from a thriving perspective, you can say, is Detroit thriving? What that really means is like, are Detroiters thriving? So thinking about not like how an environment or a set of institutions or an ecosystem does well, but how do people live better lives? And it forces you to, interrogate a different set of conditions than thinking in terms of like conventional business models or salaries or the value of a home, because those things are improving here. But if you talk to a lot of people, they're not necessarily experiencing a higher quality of life.
So if I'm hearing you right, you're talking about the metrics, the traditional metrics of capitalism, really, and you're saying that there's a lot more than that in
100%.
order to.
I mean, I would argue that there are Black folks who are senior executives at corporations, and by conventional metrics, make a lot of money, live in a nice house or in a nice neighborhood. Their kids are in a good school. But if you ask them on a daily basis, like, do you have a good day today? Like thinking about the contortions they have to do on a regular basis in order to maintain that kind of conventional success doesn't look like thriving by the lens through which I'm trying to do my work now.
When we talk about thriving, though, especially for Black folks, for people of color, we do have to acknowledge the legacy of racism that still affects people today, right? I know you're more rooted in the present and the future, but how do you hold them both?
Here's the thing. I feel like there are enough organizations and institutions oriented in that direction. Like, we're covered on adversity. Like, we know what we went through. I feel like every time someone recounts that history, I have to relive it again. All the cells in my body are like, ugh, like weighted down. And in thinking about how Black people thrive, I'm like, enough. Like, that just doesn't have to be all that we are. I get that we need to acknowledge it, and it's important to hold people, institutions, governments accountable. But I feel like a lot of times we just get stuck there and don't talk about, okay, that's there, but what else? And I also want to lean into us activating our agency. Like, in spite of all those things, we are still really capable of doing a lot of things. But I feel like we get stuck and be like, oh, well, that's just how it is. But is it? Does it have to be? It doesn't.
I was going to say, just listening to you talk a little bit now and thinking about the conversations that are had within community and the rhetoric just about, once again, leaning into this trauma bonding thing that happens oftentimes when we talk about the being downtrodden or beaten down or whatever it may be. And, for me, listening to you and just being inspired by some of the work that you do, thinking in a solution-based way versus thinking in another way. So can we talk just a little bit about that, just that rhetoric and that trauma bonding and how we can get past that conversation?
It's hard for me to even use that language. I've been saying a lot lately, like, this organization in my practice isn't around no more trials and tribulations. Like, that's covered. I want to be rooted in transcendence. I think a lot about our ancestors who were enslaved. Like, can you imagine what it took for them to even vision freedom? Like, how do you even, if everybody everybody you're related to, every generation of your family was enslaved, how do you even envision transcending that for yourself or for future generations? If they could do that, think about what we can do based on where we are.
I don't even like the follow up on that is just so huge because I think about them and they were the first Afrofuturists. They were some of the first folks who sat down and thought to themselves, there is something better out here other than what we are going through right now. So when we talk just about the idea of being an Afrofuturist, the idea of looking forward and the themes of it all, can you talk just a little bit about how that laid down that foundation to get us to where we are to get today so that we can stop looking at the negative of what's happening and look forward?
Well, for me, I wanted to be intentional about enjoying my work, and being rooted in all those gaps and adversity was not fun. Like I said, I had a visceral reaction to hearing certain things. I'm like, how can I be my ancestors' wildest dream? Did they want me to be stewed in adversity and struggle narratives? Like, when I have a choice? And I know that is hard for some people to hear. Some people will be like, no, it's not a choice to deal with struggle and adversity. But to the extent that you can, from wherever you are at, can you start to orient yourself to where you want to be versus where you don't want to be? I feel like I got really indoctrinated to like the law of attraction and The Secret. And it talks about, well, how are you going to get where you want to go if you don't know where you want to go? We're all really good at knowing what we don't want in our lives, but how often do we think about, dream about, envision about what we actually do want?
Robin and I manifest often. She's been teaching me how. She's been telling me, make sure you're writing this stuff down in the book. So I'm like, thank you, Robin. So yes, we've been working on manifesting, working on writing stuff down. We are speaking with Lauren Hood about the future of Black Detroit. She's a professor of practice and urban planning at the University of Michigan and the founder of the Institute of Afro-Urbanism. So let's talk just a little bit about Black people in the city of Detroit and your work in making sure that the future is bright.
Yeah. I think that I'm trying to lead by example with how we can do this work. Like I have fun doing my work at the Institute. It doesn't hurt. It's not painful. It's not stressful. If it becomes stressful, I'm like, this is not the right path. There must be another way that is more in flow to get where I'm trying to go. Or perhaps where I think I'm trying to go is not the highest and best destination. So I think to the extent that I can model that us Black folks, trying to improve our lived experience can be a path of joy, collective visioning, like excitement, imagination, but it's tricky. I've been intentionally staying under the radar with that because I know there are people that don't want us to live that way. So this is why you can't find a lot about what we're doing specifically for that reason. But I also am intentional about other builders, dreamers, visionaries knowing about what we're doing than trying to tell the whole world what we're doing. It's like, psst, you looking for a different way to do this? Versus like, hey, everybody.
And I think there's something important in that because there's this shield, I guess you can say, you put up around yourself, especially within the Black community, when we do understand that having the audacity to be Black does ruffle feathers.
Well, that also, not just the being Black, but the being Black and living well. Yeah. Even for Black people, seeing other Black people living well is a problem at times. Or you want to get said that you're not authentic anymore, or you don't understand what's really going on with your people. Yeah. You've isolated yourself, you've turned your back. Like, this was a conversation we had internally with the Institute has a fellowship program right now with 8 legacy Black Detroiters, and we talk about these very things. And a couple of us were talking about, I'm trying to model like holistic abundance. And then the conversation became, well, how can some of us be abundant when so many of us are in struggle? And we're like, well, you can't be what you can't see. If those of us who have access aren't modeling a certain way of being, how is anybody going to transcend? But there was an overwhelming feeling of needing to downplay our well-being so that this anonymous peanut gallery couldn't talk smack. And then it becomes like we're blocking our own abundance if we are worried about being talked about. So these are the very conversations that we're having like on a regular basis and trying to trying to navigate and overcome.
You just speaking about it just brings up things for me too. I'm thinking to myself, same shared live experience, 100%. I understand that 100%. So just getting to the fellowship is, of course, Bryce Detroit's one of those fellows there. Let's talk a little bit about the fellowship, and you talked about your cohort is going to Atlanta.
Yeah.
And going to talk to the Black people of Atlanta and talk about their success that they're having right now. So can you talk a little bit about going to Atlanta, the fellowship, and what you hope to learn?
Yeah, so since 2021, I have been interviewing Black people who are thriving in different cities, mostly in the U.S., but I did interview people in Berlin. But the metric for thriving that the Institute is using is, I think I said this last time, it's having some degree of demonstrated agency, abundance, and audacity. So it's not conventional success metrics. It's more about freedom and liberation. Like, are you living a life where you are as free as you can be? Are you the most you can be on a regular basis and still managing to, in this system of capitalism, like, do well? So that is the metric we're using. And I've interviewed people in all these different cities, New York, LA, Chicago, Atlanta, and Berlin. And the fellowship over the course of this year is going to go engage with those people that I've interviewed. So it's not necessarily like we're going to engage in a public dialogue, but I already have people who I feel like I call them our constellation versus a network. But in the Institute for Afro-Urbanism's constellation of people, I've already engaged the thrivers. There's already an existing relationship. So instead of trying to be like, hey, person at X organization, my group is coming to Atlanta, it's like, hey, I interviewed you about Black thriving. I have got this amazing cast of superhero characters coming to your town from Detroit. We want to talk to you more about what you said in your interview. Like, I'm sharing the audio of the interviews with the fellows so they can deeply understand the people that we're about to meet. So it's kind of like this world tour of Black thriving. And just keeping the conversations very rooted in, again, like aspirations, future states, wildest dreams. I use that language a lot. Like, what are our wildest dreams for the future? I think, like, having been someone who worked a lot in community engagement, I would ask people what they want, and they would give very basic responses, like, oh, it's a little dirty over here. Can you get the lights turned on? Like the crime, like very basic things. I'm like, that's your wildest dream? Your wildest dream is to just have the trash picked up. Like, that's nobody's wildest dream. That is a basic necessity. Like, how do we elevate, exponentially expand people's ideas around what is possible? That's why I think Afrofuture is like a great tool. It's just like a way to imaginate beyond convention.
Yes. I love the use of constellation as well. But speaking of Black thriving, you are developing the Black Thriving Index. How is that research project going, and what will we learn from it?
Well, this is super fun to talk about. So, I have a master's degree from a conventional academic institution. Shout out University of Detroit Mercy. And I think I was trained to think of research and data collection in a certain way. So I've done these qualitative interviews. I've done 65. They're 90 minutes on average, and we have the audio of that. So last summer, I sent myself away on a writing sabbatical. I'm like, I'm going to lock myself away in a room. I'm going to re-listen to the audio. And I'm working with this consultant who is a white guy. Culture is important. He's like, yeah, you determine what the key findings are, and then you write this white paper and tell the world about it. And that's what I told philanthropy I was going to do. But I sent myself away, and it wasn't clicking. And I was like, I talked to a friend of mine, Chanel Beebe, shout out Dr. Beebe, who is a researcher. And she was like, no, you do your work in community. Why would you think isolating yourself alone was like the way to go? And I started rethinking like how I could analyze this data in a more communal way. So part of what the fellows and I will do when we're on tour is listen to the audio of the interview with the person in the room. So we piloted that last month in Detroit. I had one of my Detroit interviewees, Valencia Vanner, a.k.a. Faya, a poet. So we played her audio with all the fellows in the room and her, and just listened to her like respond to the interview questions, and then we would pause at certain moments and like have a discussion around it. And like creating this new way of analyzing data was so much more life-giving for me. And I even Googled last summer, I was like, how do Afro-descendant people convey knowledge? It did not say white paper. It said oral histories, dance, poetry, music. And I was like, okay, everything in there like resonated deeply with my spirit. Like thinking about this white paper just wasn't hitting.
No, but an oral history or conversation about it.
So, yeah, we're having this dialogue collectively as a group and the analytics look a lot different than me being like, these are the key findings. Like, everybody who listens to it has a different key finding.
Yes. Lauren Hood is a professor of practice in urban planning at the University of Michigan and the founder of the Institute of Afro-Urbanism. And as always, Lauren, thank you so much for joining us on the Metro.
That does it for today on the Metro for Wednesday, February 19th. This is WDET-FM, Detroit Public Radio, your connection to news, music, and conversation.